All right, thanks, Jessica. And welcome to anyone who hasn't been to one of my classes before. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces, but it's always exciting to have some new people on here. So don't hesitate to ask questions throughout the class. Like Jessica said, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box as we go along. It's pretty informal. I mean, we're just learning new things here and kind of going through this handout together. And like she said, this is the first time we've done heart health with this group. And I really only had like a rough draft handout put together beforehand. So I just put this together in the last couple weeks and learned a lot of new things myself, which is always fun because, you know, a lot of these classes we end up doing over and over again, which is great for reiteration and learning because oftentimes you don't quite remember it the first time. But this is exciting because it's a brand new topic. And like I said, there's always new information coming out and we learn new things about health every year. So I hope that this will be interesting to you. All right, let's get started. So everybody pull the handout up and we're going to go through this together. So one thing that I kept thinking about when I was making this is how heart disease is just kind of in America, it's like the number one leading cause of death. And you know, right now the front lines and most of our energy and time is kind of taken up by COVID, right? And that just kind of keeps getting worse as we went through the year. It started out a little slower, and then by the end, you know, we're up to 500,000. But when we're looking at heart disease, which is kind of more of this slow, silent killer, it actually comes in at like 655,000 deaths every year. And of course, we're not dealing with like a contagious disease in this case. It's more of this progressive disease. And it does get a lot of attention, but there's also just so much that we can do about it when it comes to diet and lifestyle and all that to prevent it. But, you know, it's 1 in 3. So it's affecting so many of us, if not personally, then somebody that we know or somebody that we're close with. And it's also a very expensive health industry, you know, paying for all these different medications and operations and all that. So I put that statistic in there as well, about 475 billion or more. So part of the reason why this has been such an issue is because we haven't quite understood some of these underlying causes, and we even kind of got off on the wrong track there for a while with the low-fat diet craze, which I've talked about quite a bit in these classes. So some of that will be review for you, but we're just understanding more and more about what it takes to have a healthy heart and take care of your whole body. And that's key, actually, is that it's all connected. It's not just about one thing. So the key concepts for today's class are, number 1, cholesterol is not the culprit. So this is something that gets said over and over again. And all these health trends really become like ingrained, I feel like, especially as we get older. You know, you've heard it in your 20s maybe, and then through your 30s. And then by the time you're my parents' age, when they're in their 60s, you're still kind of saying these same catchphrases. So what I was saying is that by the time you get to your 60s and you've heard these same trends over and over and over, something will come up. Like, I think it was my dad had his blood work done the other day, and his cholesterol came back and it was good. And he said something about, oh, now I can eat more butter. And so it's almost harder to like unlearn these things that we've been taught over and over again. And in that case, the connection was like, oh, saturated fat is directly correlated to the amount of cholesterol that you have in your bloodstream, which we're going to learn a little bit further on in this handout is not always the case. And so that's number 1. We'll get into that in a minute. And then number 2 is that the microbiome plays a key role here. And if you've been in any of my classes before, that word comes up pretty much every time because it is the center of our health. And anything when it comes to disease and ailments can almost always be related back to whatever's happening in your gut and your overall gut health. So it should come as no surprise that heart health is no exception there. Although, when I was making this handout, I didn't quite think that was going to be something that would be as important as it is. And I'll explain that as well. And then number 3, fiber is important. This is something that I'm pretty sure you've all heard before, especially in relation to like heart healthy foods. And when you go around and you see products in the grocery store that say, oh, this is approved by the Heart Association, and it has that little red heart with like the check mark, and it's typically going to be in a lot of like grains and cereals and stuff, and that's mostly has to do with the amount of fiber that the product has, right? And there might be a few other components that would be helpful for heart health, but when we're looking for those check marks and a product's being approved by that, it's usually can be correlated back to the amount of fiber that it has. So we'll explain why that's important as well. And then number 4, antioxidants are your friend. We'll talk about different foods that are high in antioxidants. And that's something that's going to be important all the time because we're kind of constantly creating free radical damage just by living and breathing. You can't get away from that. Rebecca's nodding. I love it. So, when it comes to heart health, this is especially key because a lot of the problems that we end up facing with heart health, especially as we age, have to do with your arteries and capillaries and all these really sensitive, critical parts of your body that are susceptible to oxidative damage. So that's really important, is to make sure that you're getting enough antioxidants. And then number 5, vitamins and minerals in general, B vitamins, vitamin E, magnesium, and potassium. And I have a whole list here that we can get into at the end if we have time. So any questions so far? Keeping an eye on the chat box. So let's get into it. First of all, what is cardiovascular disease, or CVD? That word gets thrown around a lot, and it's actually kind of this whole collection of different things. It's classified as any disease of the heart or blood vessels, not just a single disease, but rather like a constellation of conditions that affects our circulatory system, right? So that can be arteriosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries, or atherosclerosis, which is a form of arteriosclerosis that involves buildup of plaque. So this is the one that I think a lot of us are familiar with when you think of heart disease and that artery that's like filling up with the cholesterol and turning into plaque to the point where it's actually blocking. At least that's what comes to mind when I hear of, somebody having a heart attack or something. And that's, that can happen over time, and then it restricts the blood flow, and then you get the clot and causes problems or even death in some cases. And then there's coronary artery disease. So that's just anything that affects the arteries or the heart, reducing oxygen and nutrient flow, which of course we do not want. Embolisms, a lodged blood clot. Hypertension is high blood pressure. And high blood pressure is can be a problem because over time, it might not be such a big deal for a shorter amount of time, but if you think about the blood just like flowing through your arteries at a stronger, higher rate, that's something that can cause damage or inflammation over time, because it's just kind of this constant flow that's higher than normal. And then stroke is a blood clot or bleeding in the brain. Heart failure, inability of the heart to pump sufficient blood to the rest of the body. And then arrhythmias is also in this category, and that's just like a change in the rhythm of the heartbeat. So let's get right into cholesterol and the cholesterol myth. We've been through this a little bit in the fats class, but since this is really key to heart health, we got to go over it again. So I think some of you will be familiar with this. But this is the big surprise. Cholesterol is actually a vital component of all animals. It plays a role in digesting fats, strengthening cell membranes, insulating our nerves sheaths. So there's like the myelin sheath protection, and I think it plays a role in that, which is really critical for like nerve firing. And we actually literally can't function without it. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. Cholesterol can become detrimental when it's oxidized in response to inflammation. Even when you avoid cholesterol containing products in your diet, your liver actually still produces it from either proteins, carbohydrates, or fats. So this is really interesting because people will, go on a low cholesterol diet, or they'll change their whole way of eating. I see this sometimes with people who go vegan, and then all of a sudden they've removed these cholesterol containing products from their diet, and the amount that you're even putting in from animal products is very, very, very low compared to what your body actually can make. So sometimes there's a little bit of change, like people will, say, I'm just using the example of going vegan because you're taking all those products out that contain cholesterol. They'll go vegan for maybe let's just say 4 or 5 months, get their numbers tested, and it may be a little bit lower. And part of the reason why I think that could be affected in that case is because when people choose these more vegetable heavy diets, they're actually getting a lot more fiber. So it's not always necessarily that you're getting less of the cholesterol and that's affecting it. It's that you've changed your whole way of eating. And typically, like a vegan diet is going to be much higher in vegetables and fiber, in antioxidants, and all these things that are going to play more of a role in reducing your cholesterol, in the case of the LDL cholesterol, than actually the reduction of animal products. And then most of the groundbreaking research done on cholesterol-rich diets was done on rabbits. So this is something that you get into in some of these books. And I have my resources at the bottom of this handout. So I think this is from the book, The Big Fat Surprise. And so this is where we really got off onto the wrong track back in, I want to say it was like the 50s, with those initial scientists and people that weren't even scientists but had ideas about cholesterol. They were doing cholesterol studies on animals that weren't really comparable to human beings, right? So if you take your rabbit, which is a natural herbivore, they don't eat meat, they don't eat products that even have cholesterol in them, foods. And you're doing all your studies on them and then saying, well, this is how it's going to work in human beings. That's really not going to be the case, right? So most of that information that we got on dietary cholesterol affecting blood cholesterol came from scientific studies on rabbits, which if you think about it, is just kind of really on the wrong track, because in this case, in those studies, they fed these rabbits, natural herbivores, all of these animal cholesterol rich products, and it did affect their blood cholesterol. And that's because they'd never had it before. So it's going to show up in their bloodstream. And it doesn't work that way in humans, as we now know. So cholesterol is a healing substance. This is something that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around, because I grew up with this. I'm pretty sure that most of you grew up with this idea that the word cholesterol is almost synonymous with like bad, or, it's this scary word. It's this thing that you have to get checked, and you want to make sure that your numbers are low. And, but in reality, cholesterol is like an antioxidant in our body, and it responds to inflammation in the arterial walls. And you can kind of think of it as like a fireman or a firewoman in your body, where it goes around and patches up inflammation and arterial damage, and kind of creates like a Band-Aid in a way to help, heal your body until that inflammation is taken care of. So we really do need it for that reason, along with all the reasons at the beginning that I mentioned. People with very low cholesterol levels may actually be more susceptible to infectious disease, which is kind of crazy to think about, especially right now with this infectious disease that we're trying to avoid. LDL cholesterol helps neutralize dangerous bacterial toxins and supports the immune system. Cholesterol levels lower than 160 have actually been linked to depression, aggression, and amnesia. So if you think about that, that might have to do something with those myelin sheaths and creating that like padding and antioxidant material for something, especially when we think about how our brain is like something like 60% cholesterol. It's that really saturated fatty material. It's not necessarily about good or bad cholesterol. In this day and age, we're really looking for the ratios of what those numbers are, as well as particle size. So has anybody heard that before? Maybe in one of my classes, but I hope that when you go in, your doctor might be kind of talking about that kind of stuff a little bit more. So in this case, when we're looking at LDL, which is, it's the cholesterol that was originally deemed as bad, right? That's the one where you wanted your numbers to be lower in the past. You want it to be light and fluffy particles. So if you think about that, if you have like a really hard, dense particle, it has the potential to kind of like bounce around and maybe cause more damage. And light and fluffy is what you want because it's going to be a little more gentle and not cause as much problems. And then the last one here is just that genetics plays a role in how cholesterol reacts in your body. So that's kind of always the key at the end, right? Like you can do all these things right, you can be eating really well, and genetics will still have some sort of an effect as to how cholesterol expresses itself in your body. Yeah, and on the other end of that, some people can have like extremely high cholesterol and have no damage or heart disease or anything like that. So based off of everything I just told you, I'd love for somebody to tell me in the chat box, if cholesterol isn't the culprit, what is the leading cause of heart disease? So does anybody think they know, like, what would be the main issue then in this case if cholesterol and taking all these statins to reduce your cholesterol, if that's not really the answer, what do we want to do to help our bodies be free of heart disease? Let's see, getting some answers over here. Yeah, so carbohydrates, that could be part of the problem, especially like the refined ones that we were talking about that are affecting your blood sugar, because metabolic disease is very much related to heart disease. And then somebody here got it right on the, well, a few of you actually. So inflammation. So that is exactly what I was looking for. In this case, it's low-grade inflammation, right, over time. So if the cholesterol is going in and trying to patch stuff up and your body never reduces its overall inflammation, then that cholesterol is going to stick around and eventually it's going to get calcified, the arteries are going to harden, and then you're still going to have those same issues. And the cholesterol is, in that case, definitely creating a problem, but it's there for a reason, and it's not going to go away until you fix the underlying root cause, which is inflammation. Awesome. You're so smart. So the answer in that case is low-grade inflammation, and this can occur from a number of health conditions. You know, it could even be something as simple as gingivitis. So if you have, you know, if your gums bleed a lot and when you floss, then that's something that you kind of want to get under control, especially since our oral health just goes straight into your bloodstream, which of course circulates to your heart right away. And then, gut related bacteria such as H. pylori. I have a friend right now who has been living in Costa Rica for the last, I think, like 3 or 4 years, and she cannot get rid of her H. pylori, which is this pretty gnarly bacteria that lives in your stomach and can cause ulcers and stuff. And she just is really messed up from it, because the only way you can really get rid of it is by taking antibiotics, but then it can come back. And if you get exposed to it again, then it just kind of hangs out forever. And then the other one is the C. diff, and that's really bad too. And normally these bacteria live kind of in harmony with the rest of the things that are in our microbiome. But if you have like that dysbiosis and an unbalance, then it allows these bad ones to kind of get out of control and grow and cause problems for the rest of your body. Also, things like nanobacteria, hepatitis, chronic mononucleosis, which is just mono, and then dysbiosis, like I said, from food sensitivities. So like ignoring your allergies or whatever, and having leaky gut, that can all play a role in long-term low-grade inflammation. So since our gut is the window to the outside world, we must focus on this first, which leads me into the microbiome and heart health. So any other, yeah. So my friend's actually going to see somebody, but yeah, I would love to connect them too for the H. pylori, because that's just so hard to get rid of. I should talk to you more about that. Okay, so let's get back to microbiome. The human body is inhabited by a number of bacteria, archaea, viruses, and eukaryotes. The collection of microorganisms that coexist with their host has been referred to as the microbiota or microbiome. So that's just a little definition there. Changes in the composition of gut microbiota associated with disease, referred to as dysbiosis. So dysbiosis just means like an unbalance of biology-ish, when it's in relation to your gut. And for anybody that's new, we throw the word gut around a lot, but we're just talking about anything from your mouth all the way through your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. So pretty much just your digestive tract. And that's been linked to pathologies such as atherosclerosis, hypertension, and heart failure. So why is this happening? And why do we see such an increase in heart disease in the more recent years? Part of the reason is that over the past 100 years, our gut bacteria has changed drastically. Any ideas why that might be? Like, what have we been doing that's so different in the last 100 years? And then, so yeah, part of the reason what's happening in the last 100 years in relation to diet and lifestyle, for sure, everybody's saying processed foods, that's a big part of it. Ever since kind of like that industrial revolution and the packaged food boom, more in like the 50s and 60s, people are eating very, very differently. More sedentary lifestyle, somebody is saying, that's definitely true. And also just our soil has changed quite a bit. And it's actually getting worse and worse, which is one of the many sad things of, living in 2021, is just kind of wondering where we're headed and with the agricultural scene. And, as we've processed the land, we lose vitamins and minerals. Each year it's like less and less, which is why there is actually a difference between conventional produce and organic. Like when they test those in the labs, the organic produce will have a higher concentration of vitamins and minerals. And that's just because it's getting it from the soil. So there's different farming practices in that case. So the broccoli that's grown in organic soil will have more access to these nutrients that are a little more devoid in the conventional scene, because, it's been stripped and then they're adding synthetics and stuff. So things like that are a big deal. Antibiotic use is a big deal. So we're just living really differently. And then the other thing is that people, I think we're all pretty good about that in Santa Cruz and stuff, but oftentimes people have less access to nature. And as we've learned in some of these other classes, just being exposed to the dirt or spending time in the forest or interacting with animals, which is something, people did a lot more when they had to maybe raise their own animals or have chickens or something like that. You come in contact with all these different bacteria in a good way, and that helps stimulate your immune system and adds to your microbiome. Characteristics of oral microbiota have also been detected in atherosclerotic plaque in humans. So that's where that dental hygiene comes in key, because your mouth is part of your microbiome, which is kind of interesting. And then, some vitamins actually, like vitamin K, is actually produced in our microbiome by our by gut bacteria in our small intestine. There's a few others too, like some B vitamins, I believe. So we want that to be healthy and functioning. The gut microbiome functioning as a virtual endocrine system communicates with distal organs through metabolic dependent pathways. So that's also a big deal. It's its own organ in a sense, and it creates hormones and communicates with all these other parts of your body. And then metabolites from our digestive process can actually impact our disease risk when we have an unhealthy or unbalanced microbiome. So this is a big deal, and that kind of leads me into this next part, because this is another piece that's been misunderstood, and I had to do a bunch of research on this because there's still stuff that comes up about these metabolites, and I was kind of curious about what exactly was happening there. So what we're talking about with metabolites, that just means like a byproduct of your microbiome's metabolism and how we're processing things. So let's talk a little bit about red meat, choline, and heart disease. So most of us grew up with this idea that red meat is really harmful. I still hear people say that over and over again. Well, I eat meat, but I just eat chicken, or I stay away from red meat. And while that could be helpful in some ways, people are kind of often on the wrong track about why you would avoid that, or if you should, or what to do about it. So let's clear that up a little bit. The original correlation between red meat and increased heart disease, which used to be about the saturated fat, right, and the cholesterol, is now linked to a metabolite, which is called trimethylene N-oxide, or TMAO. Has anybody heard that one before? Yeah, so of course Rebecca has. Yeah, so that one, I was a little bit familiar with it, but had to learn a little bit more. So TMAO can be formed when we eat foods that contain choline, and choline is actually something that's really important for you. But again, this is like a offshoot of that, a byproduct. So not only the red meat, but also eggs, fish, and poultry. These conclusions were based off of epidemiological studies. And this is part of the reason why nutrition stuff gets so off track sometimes. I mean, there was something, I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, where something came out on eggs, right? Eggs being bad for you, and everyone was freaking out. Oh, should I stop eating eggs now? And oftentimes it has to do with some sort of thing like this, like the TMAO or byproduct. But with an epidemiological study, that just means that they're tracking people and what they eat on a day-to-day basis. But it's so hard to get any sort of realistic information out of tracking human beings, because we're all over the place, and most people cannot remember, unless you are eating the same thing all the time, which sometimes that happens. But most of us can't remember what we had for breakfast last Tuesday. And then there's all these other different components that come into play too. So, you know, things just like stereotypical type things, like where some of those meat studies, like they would look at vegetarians and then they would look at meat eaters. But the people who were kind of interested in this vegetarian diet were also people that were very much into exercise and had these other components that were equally affecting how this played out in their overall health. So that's why these types of studies are really hard to get any kind of like realistic, logical results from. So let's get a little bit more into this. So high TMAO levels are correlated with an increase of cholesterol deposits. So this is like this TMAO is something that you don't necessarily want, because of this, ability to keep depositing cholesterol, and then that can lead to heart problems, as we know, if it's not being cleared out. A finding in the study determined that red meat eaters did not produce TMAO after a course of antibiotics. So this part was interesting because this really kind of made it less about the red meat eating and more about what's happening in your microbiome, if that makes sense. So if you're overweight, your body actually makes TMAO from visceral fat. So you can be vegetarian. And if you have that adipose tissue on your midsection, you're still going to make that byproduct, that chemical. A breakdown in the intestinal barrier, which occurs in dysbiosis, and SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth, may increase heart disease by elevating the number of circulating LDL particles in the bloodstream. So this again is, this has to do more with what's happening in your small intestine and the inflammation there. Genetics, of course, comes into play again. And this is another reason to eat a varied diet. So someone's asking, well, okay, so does that mean, is red meat bad for you? And I think short answer is no, if you're choosing, the right kinds of sources, if you can afford to do that. Of course, you don't need to eat it every day. Some people really go off track in the other direction. Like, I'm sure you've heard of people that do like carnivore diet. I can't see how that would really be good for you, because you wouldn't be getting any fiber. And meat can be a nutrient dense source of food, but you really have to be careful with quality. And like somebody is saying here, environmentally, if you're choosing the wrong kinds, that can be super detrimental as well. So choosing that sustainable stuff, that's grass fed and all that is so, so important when it comes to eating meat. So the takeaway though from the TMAO is that it really has to do with your overall gut health, because that's what's determining whether this is being expressed or not. So people who have dysbiosis, which is a lot of the population, because our microbiomes are under such stress, then this is something that can show up and, play a role in a bad way. All right. So moving on, antioxidants are your friend. Now we're getting into kind of the good stuff. So other sources of inflammation that are going to contribute to heart health issues by way of oxidative damage, that's going to be stuff like cigarette smoking. So, you can have the healthiest diet, whatever, but if you're smoking cigarettes all the time, that's actually going to cause oxidative damage, and, kind of promote that cholesterol building up. Also, ingestions of bad fats. So we talk a lot about good fats, but there are a few bad ones out there still, and that's going to be trans fats or oxidized fats or rancid fats. So those are all things that you want to avoid for that reason. Having high blood pressure, like I talked about, chronic stress. Again, you can be the healthiest person ever, but if you're just stressing out constantly, it's going to affect you, because it affects your hormones and everything else. It affects your blood pressure as well. And then glucose intolerance. So that's type 1 or type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. And part of the reason there, which I've explained in classes before, is that with glucose intolerance, your pancreas isn't making enough insulin. So the sugar and the glucose in your that's coming in through your diet is getting into your bloodstream, and then it really doesn't have anywhere to go. And then it can cause oxidative damage from there just by like running around wreaking havoc. So someone's asking, can you tell if you have dysbiosis or SIBO? There's actually a breath test for SIBO. You just have to order it online. It's like a kit, and you just do like a breathe into some little like kit thing, and then they can test to see like the metabolites. But typically with dysbiosis, it shows up in form of, gastrointestinal issues, constipation, diarrhea, digestive issues, or food intolerances. As a nutritionist, I'm going to say that pretty much all of us are going to have some level of it. Maybe it would be very, very low in some of us, but this is something that I've struggled with for years, just trying to get it back in balance, because it's so easy to mess ourselves up just from, the medications we take, or being stressed out, and the amount of different things that we eat on a regular basis. So yeah, that's just kind of a constant struggle, but I can definitely talk to you more about that. I feel like you might have some ideas if you thought you had that. And then toxic chemicals, metals, and environmental pollutants. Again, this is all stuff that we're exposed to on a regular basis. Alcohol is going to cause oxidative stress. Having a copper deficiency, which is actually much more common than you might think. And that's something that you have to get through food. You don't really want to take that as a supplement because it's different forms. Just for an example, copper comes from foods like, like liver, or like foods that you don't typically eat a lot of these days because they're way out of style, out of trend, and not something that you would even think of getting. I'd have to look to see what other food sources, because I think it might be some nuts and seeds or something for vegetarian stuff. And then also vitamin A and D deficiency. And those are fat soluble vitamins. And pretty much everyone gets a vitamin D deficiency during the winter months, especially where we're living, where the sun's just not out right now. So oxidative stress can cause a chain reaction of free radical damage. This is a causal factor in heart disease, because remember, like, this oxidative stress is what's maybe causing the holes or the inflammation in the arteries and capillaries. And then that's when the LDL particles are coming in and actually building up or becoming oxidized and hardening and leading way to heart disease. And then just going to touch on fiber. You guys are all pretty familiar with it, but it's key for a number of reasons. Insoluble fiber helps clear out the excess LDL. So, we've determined that LDL can be helpful in some ways, but you still don't want to have like a huge buildup of it. And one of the ways that we get rid of it on a daily basis is by having enough fiber. And then on the other end, some of those prebiotic fibers actually provide food for your good bugs in your microbiome. And so with our microbiome, we really just want to create this environment that helps those good bacteria stick around and say, oh, this is a nice place for me to live, rather than just passing through. So some examples: insoluble fiber, that's going to be like whole grains, wheat cereals, vegetables. And then soluble is kind of more of the like barley, oatmeal, beans. You can see the whole list here. So both types are important for heart health. The minimum baseline recommended dairy dietary allowance is 20 grams. So that's on the very, very low end. But if you're at all worried about heart disease or have any sort of metabolic syndrome issue, then you want to increase that like almost by twice as much. So closer to 38 grams. But if you start tracking stuff and taking a look at things, like one of the examples I like to give is a cup of raspberries has about 8 grams of fiber. So that's like pretty close to a third of what you need in a day, even if you're trying to get the higher amount or a quarter. All right, so mouth's drying out. Let's see about this question here. So what amount of copper is needed daily and what are the best food sources? I have to actually look that up. Like I was saying, the one that I was remembering off the top of my head was liver. So you can either get beef liver or chicken liver. I've seen it around town at Wild Roots and Staff of Life, and it'll usually be like in the frozen section because it doesn't keep for very long. Organ meats are really like delicate. And the way that I like to do that is to actually pulverize it and then like hide it in stuff. So if you are a meat eater, you could put it in like a burger or a meatloaf or something like that. So it's because it's going to have a stronger flavor. And that would be like the highest amount. That's like the highest food source is what I'm trying to say. And then there's a few others. I'd have to check my books because I did just recently look it up, but it's not sticking to see what else is in there. And then to check it, you need to go get a lab done for that to see what your numbers are, or actually a hair analysis you can get it from that too. And that's something that's easy to send in online. So let's talk about some heart healthy foods to add to your diet. Acai berries. I mean, that was super trendy for a long time, but they're still really good for you. And that's going to be mostly because of these antioxidants. Any of those berries that are like really dark in color are going to be great for antioxidant boosting. But just make sure you get the unsweetened packets if you're buying that from the store. Some of them have the added cane sugar, much higher antioxidant content than cranberries, blueberries, or strawberries, but those are all good as well. And then it also has some vitamin A, which is cool. And almonds are on the list too. I like those. I put my drawing at the top of the page where if you put two together, it actually looks like a little heart. But this is a great thing to have for a snack because of the vitamin E, which is an antioxidant, also magnesium and phosphorus. That's going to be helpful for blood sugar balance. And they also have like a really nice amount of fiber too. So getting those from bulk or whatever, however you like to have them. Broccoli is a good source for magnesium as well as calcium. You know, this is another thing that we've been taught over the years is that dairy is like the best source for calcium. And while it does have calcium, a lot of these green vegetables have even more. So things like broccoli is good for calcium. Also B6 and folate will help with atherosclerosis, heart attack, and stroke. Obviously, that's going to be in the produce department. Cinnamon is actually really helpful for blood sugar balance. It also can help break down bile salts and keeps the blood the proper thickness, so stops your platelets from thickening too much. And also, I just like that it kind of adds sweetness to any sort of dish without adding sugar. So that's a good thing to have around, on hand in your shaker to put in whatever. You can go like sweet or savory with cinnamon, which I love. Let me just check on these questions. Almonds better raw or roasted? Ultimately, sprouted would be the best. If you've ever had one of my classes where we talk about nuts and seeds, if they've been already activated, where they've been sprouted and dehydrated, you're going to digest them better. But other than that, just pick your preference. I don't think raw or roasted is going to necessarily be better one way or the other. And then frozen veggies, yes, they're just as good as fresh. When we freeze things, we just kind of stop it in its tracks so that it's not losing any nutrient value. Also, with vegetables, you really just want to go for convenience. So if you're going to have a bag of frozen broccoli in your freezer and you're going to use that, that's way better than just not having any because you didn't have any fresh. So absolutely utilize the frozen vegetables. Is broccoli better than kale or collards? Not necessarily. I'd love for people to switch things up because remember, anyone who's, you know, been with me for the last 2 years, I'm going to say, knows that for that microbiome that we're all trying to strive for, you want to have the most varied diet possible. So if you're eating your broccoli every night, you're not going to create as much variety in there as you would if you had broccoli and then kale and then some collards. So be sure to just switch it up from time to time. And then buying nuts in bulk, that's not Amazon. I mean, if you're not trying to get it in person, I know, yeah, there's Costco. And then, I mean, if you're in town, like New Leaf or any of those stores, also, they still have bulk, I'm pretty sure, if you feel like venturing to the store. Also, Thrive Market is pretty good if you want like an online situation, but that's like a membership for health food. And then pastured butter. So getting over that fear of saturated fat. It's going to have omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory, and conjugated linoleic acid, antioxidants, flax seeds. Lignans are helpful for reducing atherosclerotic plaque buildup by 75%, which is a big deal. That's something you definitely want to keep in your fridge because flax and flax oil is susceptible to oxidation. So also it's been shown to decrease your levels of LDL cholesterol. So that's a really good thing for heart health. And then chia seeds are kind of in that same category. Super good source of fiber. Lentils are a big one for reducing cholesterol with that extra soluble fiber that's kind of acting as a broom to sweep it out. Also a source of folate and magnesium. Olive oil. So olive oil has been in forever. It's still a good thing to have. Really good for, I mean, it's just, olives are a great heart healthy food. That's also one of the pictures that I put at the beginning of the handout. Helps normalize blood clotting. MUFA is monounsaturated fatty acids. So that's really good for heart health as well. Helps keep your arteries clear. Just obviously, we're going to use olive oil on everything. And then quinoa is a good thing to have around, especially to switch it up with rice, which is fine, but quinoa is going to have a little more fiber and more protein as well. Wild salmon is a good source for your omega-3s. We're super familiar with it for that, particularly the long chain or EPA. Lower in heavy metals, which we're always going to be looking out for as well. And then the last one on the list is strawberries. And strawberries are another food that looks kind of like a heart. So sometimes it's fun to notice that foods that correlate with different organs are actually good for those organs. So strawberries are actually a really good source of vitamin C, which is an antioxidant. They have even more vitamin C than citrus, I believe. Vitamin K, fiber, and flavonoids, which protect against inflammation, heart disease, and cancer. And those are just about to come back into season, which is really exciting. So the rest of this handout is just a few recipes. I made this citrus beet salad the other day, which was really good. Just steam some beets. So beets is another heart healthy food. I just didn't put it in there, but you got 2 beet recipes. And then there's some resources in case you want to look any of this up and read more in depth, because I just gave you kind of like the highlights. This book, The Big Fat Surprise, is really interesting. I have a copy myself, and it's just always, it kind of goes through all that history of stuff that we've learned over the years, and where we got off track.